Major Hans Joachim Reber filed a combat claim on the afternoon of October 14, 1943, over the skies above Germany, that his own wing intelligence officer initially rejected as administratively impossible. Reber had claimed the same American B-17 as destroyed 4 separate times within a single engagement, each time citing damage he considered, by every standard of his considerable combat experience, mortal to the aircraft, an engine trailing flame, a wing spar visibly compromised, a tail section shredded by cannon fire, and finally a direct hit to the cockpit area that should have killed or incapacitated the flight crew outright. The bomber landed at its home airfield in England that evening, badly damaged but intact, all 10 crewmen aboard, 7 of them wounded. Reber's own combat report, submitted before he learned the aircraft had survived, closes with a line his intelligence officer would later flag for the wing's official record. I engaged this aircraft on 4 separate passes and inflicted damage on each occasion that I assessed, in the moment, as sufficient to bring it down. I do not know how to account for the fact that it apparently continued flying regardless. I record this discrepancy honestly rather than adjusting my account to match what should have happened. Reber was, by October of 1943, one of the more accomplished fighter pilots in his wing, credited with over 30 confirmed victories across engagements on both the Eastern Front, and more recently, in the increasingly desperate defense of German airspace against the growing weight of the American daylight bombing campaign. He had developed, across hundreds of combat sorties, what he considered a reliable professional understanding of exactly how much damage a 4-engine bomber could absorb before it became, in practical terms, no longer capable of remaining airborne. His theory, refined through direct observation of dozens of previous engagements, held that a B-17 losing an engine to fire, suffering visible structural damage to a wing, and sustaining direct hits to its control surfaces represented, in combination, damage well beyond what any bomber crew could reasonably expect to survive, let alone continue flying and fighting through. He had watched this theory confirmed in engagement after engagement, against bomber after bomber, across nearly 2 years of increasingly intense daylight combat over German-controlled airspace. He would spend the remainder of the war, according to his own post-war recollections, revisiting the specific afternoon his theory first failed to hold against a single bomber that seemed to regard the damage he inflicted upon it less as a crisis to be feared than as a series of problems to be methodically managed, one at a time, by a crew that simply declined to stop functioning regardless of what his cannon fire did to their aircraft. B-17 that Reber would engage 4 times that October afternoon was named, by her crew, the Carolina Widow, a name chosen, according to a pilot's own later account, with the particular gallows humor common among bomber crews of the period, and one that would prove, by the war's end, considerably less applicable to the men who flew her than its authors had perhaps intended. She belonged to the 612th Bombardment Group, a unit whose training doctrine, developed under the command of Colonel Everett Marsh, placed unusual emphasis on what Marsh himself described, in a training memorandum that circulated widely enough within the group to become something close to institutional creed, as the survivable damage principle. Marsh had studied, in exhaustive detail, the after-action reports of bombers lost across the group's earlier combat tours, and had concluded that a meaningful proportion of aircraft losses resulted not from damage that was truly unsurvivable, but from crews who lacked the specific procedural knowledge and disciplined calm necessary to manage survivable damage correctly under the extreme stress of sustained aerial combat. A B-17 is built with considerable redundancy. Marsh told his aircrews, according to an account given by a surviving navigator decades later. She can lose an engine and still fly. She can take considerable damage to a wing and still hold together, provided the men aboard her know precisely what needs doing and do it without hesitation. What kills a crew, more often than the damage itself, is panic, confusion, or simply not knowing the aircraft well enough to recognize that a wound that looks fatal may not actually be one, if it's managed correctly and quickly. This philosophy shaped an unusually rigorous emergency procedures training program that every crew in the 612th completed before their first combat mission engine fire suppression, drilled to reflex, structural damage assessment, practiced repeatedly in simulated scenarios, and critically, a doctrine of continued offensive gunnery, even under severe damage, on the theory, articulated explicitly by Marsh, that a bomber which stopped defending itself the moment it sustained serious damage was considerably more likely to be finished off by a following attack than one whose gunners continued fighting regardless of the aircraft's condition. Captain Everett Doyle, the Carolina Widow's pilot, had absorbed this training with particular thoroughness, according to his co-pilot's later account. Doyle used to say that panicking about damage you couldn't do anything about was wasted effort, better spent flying the airplane and letting the crew handle what they'd been trained to handle. Wasn't that he didn't feel fear, same as the rest of us. Was that he'd trained himself to put the fear somewhere it didn't interfere with flying the aircraft, and he expected the same discipline from every man aboard. By the time the Carolina Widow took off on the morning of October 14th, 1943, on what would become the defining mission of her combat career, her crew had spent nearly 8 months flying and training together, developing a level of coordinated familiarity with both their aircraft and each other that would prove, over the following 90 minutes of sustained aerial combat, considerably more consequential than any single tactical decision made that day. There was a specific exercise within Marsh's training program, remembered by several surviving crewmen decades later as the one that most directly shaped their eventual conduct under fire, that the group referred to informally as the Cascade. Rather than simulating a single system failure in isolation, instructors would introduce a sequence of compounding emergencies during training flights. A simulated engine fire followed, before the crew had fully resolved it, by a simulated hydraulic failure, followed in turn by a simulated wound to a key crew position that required another man to assume unfamiliar duties without warning. Several crews found the exercise exhausting, and in the words of one surviving radio operator, almost cruel, given how tired we already were most days. Marsh's response to this criticism, recorded in a training memorandum preserved among his personal papers, was direct. Combat does not introduce its emergencies one at a time, politely waiting for the crew to finish with the last one before beginning the next. If we train men only for isolated failures, we are training them for a war that does not exist. I would rather my crews resent me now, in training, than discover in combat that they were never prepared for what actually came at them. Reber's first attack run, executed with the practiced precision of an experienced ace, struck the Carolina Widow's No. 3 engine directly, setting it ablaze in a manner that, from Reber's cockpit, appeared unambiguously fatal to the aircraft's continued flight. What Reber could not observe from his own cockpit was the immediate, drilled response inside the bomber itself. Flight engineer Nathaniel Osai, manning the top turret, feathered the burning engine's propeller within seconds of the hit, cutting off its fuel supply and activating the built-in fire suppression system that Marsh's training program had drilled every engineer in the group to execute without conscious deliberation. Wasn't really thinking about it as a decision, Osai recalled in a post-war interview. Just doing exactly what we drilled 100 times over feather the prop, cut the fuel, hit the extinguisher, and keep an eye on it to make sure the fire's actually out rather than just hidden. Engine was gone as a working engine, sure, but a dead, feathered engine on a B-17 isn't the same thing as a dying airplane. She flies fine on 3, provided the rest of the crew keeps doing their jobs same as I did mine. Reber's combat report notes the engine fire with the confidence of a man who expected the engagement to conclude within the following minute. Direct hit, engine 3, immediate and substantial fire observed, assessing a certain loss within moments. When the Carolina Widow did not fall from formation as Reber expected, he maneuvered for a second attack, this time striking the bomber's wing structure directly, an area of damage that his considerable combat experience told him represented an even more serious threat to the aircraft's structural integrity than the engine fire had been. The hit tore a substantial section of the wing's outer skin and damaged an internal spar, an injury that Doyle himself, feeling the aircraft's altered handling characteristics through the controls, assessed as genuinely dangerous. Could feel her wanting to roll wrong the second that hit landed, Doyle said in his own post-war account. Took real concentration to keep her level and flying straight after that. But concentration was something I had plenty of, whatever else that hit had taken from us, and the airplane, battered as she was still willing to do what I asked of her, provided I asked carefully and didn't panic into overcorrecting. Reber's log entry following the second hit records a note of genuine professional bewilderment that his squadron commander would later specifically highlight during a review of the engagement. Second direct hit, wing structure, visible spar damage. By every precedent available to me from previous engagements against this aircraft type, this represents damage that should force the aircraft into an uncontrolled descent within minutes. Target continues in formation, maintaining altitude and heading. Reber's third attack run struck the bomber's tail section, shredding significant portions of the tail gunner's position and damaging the aircraft's rudder control, an attack that, in any previous engagement Reber could recall, would have represented the moment a target's defensive fire finally fell silent, as the crew's attention turned entirely to survival rather than continued resistance. It was at this point that Staff Sergeant Curtis Vance, the Carolina Widow's ball turret gunner, began engaging Reber's fighter directly, tracking the attacking aircraft through its firing pass with the same disciplined focus his training had drilled into him regardless of the chaos unfolding elsewhere aboard the bomber. Tail gunner was down, hurt bad, and I could hear it over the intercom, Vance recalled decades later. But somebody needed to keep that fighter honest, keep him thinking about his own survival instead of just lining up another easy pass, and the ball turret still worked, and I was still in it, so that's what I did. Wasn't complicated thinking, just seemed like the thing that needed doing right then. Reber's log entry describing this exchange contains the clearest indication of the psychological shift that would eventually shape his own account of the engagement's aftermath. Target's tail section severely damaged, tail gunner position apparently silenced. Continued defensive fire observed from a different position aboard the aircraft, suggesting the crew has redistributed defensive coverage, despite what should represent crippling cumulative damage at this point in the engagement. I confess, I do not fully understand the discipline this requires. Reber's fourth and final attack, run, executed with what he later described as genuine determination to finally end an engagement that had, by that point, lasted considerably longer and cost him considerably more ammunition than any previous encounter with a single bomber, struck the Carolina Widow's cockpit area directly, wounding both Doyle and his co-pilot, Lieutenant Aldo Bianchi, and shattering a significant portion of the cockpit's forward glass. What followed, according to the account later reconstructed from crew debriefings and Bianchi's own post-war testimony, represented the engagement's most severe test of the crew's collective discipline. Doyle, wounded in the shoulder and losing blood, continued flying the aircraft with Bianchi's assistance, the two men managing the controls together through a combination of Doyle's experience and Bianchi's steadying presence, despite his own injuries. Don't remember deciding to keep flying instead of handing off the controls entirely, Doyle said in a later interview. Just remember that Bianchi was there, hurt same as me but functional, and between the two of us, we had enough hands and enough clarity to keep her level and keep her moving toward home. Wasn't heroic, particularly. Was just doing the job that was directly in front of me, one control input at a time, because the alternative, letting her go down with the whole crew still aboard, wasn't something I was prepared to accept while there was still a way to prevent it. Reber, observing the aircraft's continued level flight, despite what he assessed as a direct and serious hit to the cockpit itself, broke off his attack, according to his own combat report, having exhausted my ammunition and my ability to explain, through any framework available to me, why this aircraft continued flying after damage that should have ended the engagement on at least 3 separate previous occasions. Flight engineer Nathaniel Osai, whose swift, drilled response to the first engine fire prevented what could have been an immediately catastrophic loss of the aircraft, was 26 years old, a former aircraft mechanic from Georgia, whose pre-war technical background gave him, according to his crewmates, an unusually intuitive feel for the specific mechanical realities of keeping a badly damaged B-17 airborne. Asked years later what had allowed him to respond so quickly and correctly to the engine fire, despite the chaos of the moment, OSI offered an answer notable for its plain, technical framing. Wasn't thinking about anything except the procedure, if I'm honest. Feather, cut fuel, extinguish monitor. Drilled it enough times that my hands knew what to do before my mind had fully caught up to what had actually happened. That's most of what training's actually for. I've come to believe not teaching you to think clearly under that kind of pressure, because most men can't, but teaching your hands to do the right thing even when your mind's too overwhelmed to manage it consciously. Staff Sergeant Curtis Vance, the ball turret gunner who continued engaging Rebur's fighter after the tail gunner position had been silenced, gave a similarly understated account in a post-war interview. Wasn't brave, particularly, the way people like to frame it afterward. Was just the only man left in a position to keep that fighter thinking about his own hide instead of lining up another clean shot at us. Seemed like an obvious enough thing to do once I understood the situation, and I didn't have much leisure to consider alternatives at the time. Lieutenant Aldo Bianchi, the wounded co-pilot who helped Doyle manage the aircraft's controls through the final and most severe damage of the engagement, offered what may be the crew's most direct account of collective discipline under extraordinary pressure in an interview conducted decades later. Everybody aboard that airplane was doing their own piece of it, hurt or not, scared or not, and I think that's really the whole explanation for why we made it home, if anybody's looking for one. Wasn't any single man's heroics that got us back. Was 10 men, each one doing his own job as well as he was able, for as long as his body would let him, and somehow that added up to an airplane that kept flying when it probably shouldn't have. The assessment that traveled furthest through the German chain of command came from Oberst Wilhelm Forst, the wing commander to whom Rebur's combat report was ultimately submitted, who included an extended discussion of the engagement in a broader post-war analysis of the Luftwaffe's daylight defense campaign against American heavy bombers. I reviewed Major Rebur's combat report with considerable professional interest when it first crossed my desk. Forst wrote, in part because Rebur was, by any reasonable assessment, among the more skilled and experienced fighter pilots in my wing, and a report describing 4 separate attacks against a single bomber, each apparently inflicting damage that should have proven fatal, represented either a highly unusual anomaly or a systematic failure in our own understanding of American bomber survivability that warranted serious investigation. I have since concluded it was considerably more the latter than the former. He continues, in a passage later cited in post-war studies of the air campaign's closing phases. By late 1943, American bomber crews had developed, through hard experience across an increasingly costly campaign, a level of procedural discipline in damage control and continued defensive gunnery that our own tactical assumptions, built largely on earlier engagements against less experienced crews, had not adequately accounted for. Rebur's engagement with this particular aircraft represents, in my assessment, one of the clearer illustrations available to us of exactly why our daylight interception campaign, however tactically sound in principle, was increasingly encountering an adversary whose survivability had been deliberately and systematically engineered through training rather than through any change in the aircraft itself. Forst closes his assessment with a line that a Luftwaffe historian reviewing the document decades later flagged as unusually candid for a wartime wing commander's formal correspondence. We built our interception doctrine around calculated estimates of how much damage a 4-engine bomber could sustain before ceasing to be an effective threat. I do not believe this calculation remained reliable as the American training programs matured, and I believe Rebur's engagement on October 14, 1943, represents one of the more instructive failures of that calculation available in our own records. I do not fault Rebur for the outcome. I believe a different pilot in his position would very likely have reached the same conclusion he did, and recorded the same honest bewilderment, once the true character of what he was engaging became apparent to him over the course of that single, extended encounter. The Carolina Widow completed 19 more combat missions before the war's end, flown by a largely intact version of the same crew that had brought her home on October 14, 1943, though Doyle, Bianchi, and 5 other crewmen carried wounds from that engagement for the remainder of their lives. Hans Joachim Reber survived the war, was held briefly as a prisoner following Germany's surrender, and returned to a country attempting, in its own fractured way, to reckon with what the conflict had cost on every side. He rarely discussed the October 14th engagement publicly in the decades that followed, according to family members interviewed for a post-war aviation history project, with one notable exception late in his life, when a graduate student researching Luftwaffe combat claims asked him directly why that particular engagement, among the more than 30 confirmed victories of his combat career, appeared to have remained more vivid in his memory than any other. He considered the question for a long moment, according to the student's own notes from the interview, before answering. I have turned that afternoon over in my memory more times than I could count in the decades since. I engaged that aircraft 4 times, and by every professional standard I had developed across years of combat, I should have destroyed it on at least the first or second occasion. I did not. I have concluded, after much reflection, that the explanation has less to do with the aircraft itself than with the men aboard it, a crew that had, through training and through whatever bond 10 men develop across months of flying together, simply declined to stop functioning regardless of what damage I inflicted upon them. I do not know if the correct word for what I encountered is discipline or courage, or simply an extraordinary and specific competence that our own doctrine had not adequately prepared me to expect. I know only that I have never forgotten it, and that I have come, over many years, to a kind of professional respect for it that I did not feel in the moment itself, when my only wish was that the aircraft would simply go down and allow the engagement to conclude the way every previous engagement of my career had concluded. Everett Doyle, interviewed near the end of his own long life for a regional oral history project, was asked what he believed had actually kept the Carolina Widow flying through an afternoon that, by any reasonable calculation, should have ended considerably worse than it did. He gave an answer that several of his surviving crewmates remembered well enough to repeat, nearly word for word, at reunions for decades afterward. Wasn't the airplane, exactly, though she was a good, tough old bird, and I'll always be grateful for what she absorbed that day without quitting on us entirely. Was the crew, and the training, and I suppose something harder to name, that grew between 10 men over 8 months of flying together into whatever that German pilot ran into that afternoon. He hit us 4 times, by his own account, and every time, somebody aboard that airplane did exactly what needed doing to keep her in the air a little longer. That's the whole of the explanation, so far as I've ever been able to work it out. Wasn't luck. Was just 10 men who decided, each in his own way, long before that mission ever started, that quitting wasn't an option they were prepared to consider, whatever damage came at us. 4 separate attacks. 4 separate moments when, by every rule of aerial combat either man had ever learned, the engagement should have ended. The bomber came home anyway, carrying 10 men who had simply refused, one system and one wound at a time, to let it do anything else. The Carolina Widow herself, retired from combat service after the war and eventually scrapped like most of her sisters, survives today only in a handful of photographs and in the memories of the men who flew her and their families after them. At a reunion held decades later, one of Doyle's grandchildren, hearing the story for perhaps the 100th time, reportedly asked her grandfather the simplest possible question, the one that every account of the engagement seems, in its own way, to be circling without quite landing on directly. Why hadn't they simply been afraid enough to give up? Doyle considered it, according to the family member who recorded the exchange, with the same unhurried patience he seemed to bring to most difficult questions. We were afraid, he said. Every one of us, the whole way home. Fear never once stopped being part of it. What stopped being part of it was letting the fear make our decisions for us, and I don't know a shorter way to explain the difference than just to say we'd already decided, long before that morning, which one of those 2 things we were going to be. That is the whole of the story. That is all it ever was.